Hello, Jerry. Wonderful to have you here.
Hi, Katie. It's good to see you.
I absolutely loved your book, Reboot. I have it right here by my side.
Hmm.
It is so beautifully poetical with all these images of lemon drops and asteroids and open, broken hearted warriors.
Hmm.
It's also super honest and deep. And I'm wondering what led you to write Reboot?
What led me to write Reboot? Well, thank you for the kind words about the book. First of all, I should note that before we go on. I think that in some ways, I needed to write from my heart. In the book, I talk about being a young boy in Brooklyn and discovering the power of books at around 13, 14 years old, to really be a refuge in a very chaotic world. And I think that the call to write my way to making sense of the world began at an early age. And so, I kind of acknowledge that that's my first published book. It is by no means my first experience in the art of writing. And whether it's my daily journaling practice, which has been going on since I was 13, or not quite completed attempts throughout the years at different novels and different poems, um, my relationship with words has always been there. And so that's why it took me a minute to sort of really understand. What led me to writing that book was everything that had occurred in my life prior to, if that makes any sense. And if you read the book, it makes sense, right? Yeah.
Yes, this comes across your entire life and all your massive breakthroughs and also your struggles. But more specifically, I'm wondering, were there any crucible moments or breakthroughs that you went through while you were writing it?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, one of the most surprising things for me during the process was literally every time I was in an issue, life was throwing something at me. In the irrational other chapter, which I talk about my mother's mental illness, really as an archetype against which I have come to understand how I react to anyone that I perceive as acting in a way that is dangerous, right? Which is could be highly anxious or it could be highly aggressive. I was working on a relationship that is deeply, deeply meaningful to me and challenging. So literally at that moment, the gods shined on me and said, "Oh, here's something served up." As I wrote in the afterward, um, two things happened in the process of the manuscript. One is that my good mother, the mother who really raised me into adulthood, Dr. Sayers, died.
Yes, you're right about that.
Uh, and then the other thing that happened was I was diagnosed with heart disease, which I'm fine, but at the time was a real curveball. And rather than not addressing those things in the book, um, as you know from the book, I have a predilection to show up in fullness, and I to be intellectually honest and in integrity. I had to actually take the emotional parts of those experiences and put them in the book because that's what was real and true and going on for me at the time. I didn't have to give all the details, but I had to be present with those emotions. So there were many crucible moments in the book writing process for me. Not the least of which, by the way, was just an editor calling me up and saying, "Hey, you want to write a book?" It's like, what? have you been listening to my dreams for the last 50 years? Right?
Yes, you mentioned that in the introduction. And I feel that this really comes across, and it also inspires other leaders to be more brutally honest with themselves and with others. So that's why it's so wonderful, because you're literally directly practicing what you're encouraging others to do. And this leads me to
Yeah,
that. Go
can I
on,
say a
sorry.
word about that?
Of course.
I do reference this in the introduction, but one of the things that I dislike about a lot of either self-help advice books or leadership books is that the authors will sometimes take that sage on a stage stance, where they're the all-knowing person and they're giving you the 5 rules. I can't stand that, because it's like when a teacher stands up in front of a classroom and they're not connected to the students. And so it comes off as BS. It comes off as something not trustworthy, not believable. But when the person is brave enough to show up with their own foibles, it creates a deeper connection. And the result of that is that there's a certain kind of psychological safety that you hopefully felt when you were reading the book, right? So here's this guy who is now projected onto a pedestal because he has a book with that fancy author photo at the back flap, right? And he's being real. I get to show up. And, by the way, that's not just a call to action for writers. It's a call to action for leaders, right? To show up in an organization in exactly the same way. So that was a long-winded response to your question. I hope that was okay.
Yes, I think this again really comes across in the way that you write, and it does invite others to do the same. And this sort of leads me to that equation you talk about at the beginning, which is the practical skills plus radical self-inquiry plus shared experiences equals enhanced leadership and greater resilience. And what I feel is a lot of people focus on those practical skills, and too few people focus on the radical self-inquiry and shared experiences. So could you say a bit more about why these are so fundamental to make people great leaders?
Well, yes, and you grok the meaning of that entire purpose as well. And what's really important to understand is that the practical skills are very important, right? The problem is that when a leader or someone who holds power just focuses on that, they unintentionally, often unconsciously, create conditions of toxicity and lack of safety throughout the organization. And what I mean is, when a leader takes the position of this is the way to do things, what it does is it subtly but unmistakably disempowers everyone around them and infantilizes them. And then the leader calls up their coach and says, why can't anybody make any decisions on their own? I don't understand this. Okay. And so when we assert that power and we couple it with radical self-inquiry, the ability to actually strip away our own mask and see how we're motivated, what you get is this powerful combination of true presence, true authenticity, true vulnerability, so that I can assert something like, hey, when we launch a new product, it needs to have 40% margins. But it will land with a sense of truthfulness and trustworthiness. Because when I add to that and I say, because my long-term wish is that this is a company in which not only do we do things that do good work, but we do it well. And so it's done with a kind of skillfulness and craft so that there's long-term value created. Now let's just pause. And I see from your face that you're just appreciating the combination of those two things. Am I right about that?
Yes, I was just thinking that it sounds to me like you're saying that if you're authentic and vulnerable as a leader, you create more trust.
Yes. And notice I didn't use the word vulnerable. I think I didn't use the word
No,
vulnerable.
I
And
interpreted it as vulnerable.
yeah. And the reason I tend to stay away from that word is that vulnerability as a word is really scary for people.
Mm,
It's evocative of weakness.
mm,
And that's how we've actually socialized ourselves, right? And it can be very confusing to people. So I like to insert words like be honest, be real, right? Because and you're smiling because then the connection to trust becomes more obvious. Oh, you mean if I show up and I'm real, people will believe me, right? When I get called into organizations and they say, you know, we have a trust problem. And then I pause and I say, well, are you telling each other the truth? Oh, no, no, no. We don't trust each other. We can't tell each other the truth. It's like, well, guess what's going to happen, right? So safety and trust are derived from honesty, right? And when a leader masks the things that they struggle with and pretend that they in fact don't, they're being less than forthright, less than honest. That's why I emphasize that so much.
Yes, and this reminds me of the several examples that you put in the book of different coaching conversations and moments. And as a coach myself, I really, really love these. I could totally identify and see the breakthrough, right? Oh, here the conflict, are they being honest, tying it together to the past, the ghost. It was amazing. So for all the coaches listening, it's also a great book from that perspective. I want to go on a bit of a tangent here, but I felt this was incredibly valuable. You've coached a lot of CEOs and executives, and a really common trait of CEOs, executive, business owners, founders, entrepreneurs, the whole lot, is this tendency to always be busy. And you have this beautiful sentence, I absolutely adore it, which is that we merge what we do with what we are. We're nothing if we are not doing. I am wondering, how have you helped executives to step off the busy treadmill?
Well, what comes to mind is a conversation I had with a client just before a call. And I pointed out, I had him draw on a piece of paper a standard pyramid. And I said, okay, so where are you on the pyramid? He's a CEO and he puts himself at the apex. I said, and how does that all feel? He said, well, you know, it's what I'm supposed to do and all that stuff. I said, so who has all the information? Who has all the power and who has all of that? So he says, the person at that apex. I said, so what happens about decision making? What happens about doing? So, well, it all flows through me. Now we start to understand busyness, right? So there's a relationship between being so busy and the lack of scalability within the organization, right? See, if you take someone who is socialized to be a high achiever, you take someone who early on figured out how to get the best grades in the class, not necessarily do the best work, how to get the best grades, and you move them through their career and they end up launching their own business or rising through an organization rank, what they see themselves as is moving up that pyramid to an apex point of, you know, all knowing, all powerful, always right. And that's an impossible place to be, right? And so, of course, we flip the pyramid. I pull in the notion of servant leadership. And then I say, my goal is to have you, and I often make this reference, the book Tom Sawyer has this funny little anecdote where Tom, who's the cleverest person around, convinces everybody else to pay him to paint the fence that he's supposed to paint. And I make them laugh and I say, your job is to be Tom Sawyer. Your job is to hire great people and unleash them so that they do the best work of their lives. I said, and I'll know it's working when the organization is not only making decisions without you, but they are doing things that astonish you and surprise you. And you're bored at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, and you go home early, right? Now, when I lay that all out versus my calendar is wall-to-wall meetings and I'm so busy I can't even breathe, they say, oh, I want that other life where the machine of the business is just working like a well-oiled machine, like it's just the gears are just running. And people are happy, right? And it all comes from taking ourselves out of that position on the pyramid, the apex of that pyramid.
That's what I was going to say. So basically, by reversing the pyramid and looking at it from a servant leadership position, this enables them to accept not taking all the decisions, not making all the decisions, and therefore being less busy. But I'm also feeling they need to step in then into the trust and support of the employees. So it's like a double trust route, because first it was how do they get trusted as a leader, and now is how do they trust their employees so they can actually let go of everything they're taking on.
That's right. And that merger of self-worth with external activities is the impediment to that trust. See, if I trust and I let my employees be adults, what happens when they drop a ball? Right? If my self-esteem is wrapped up in the performance of the organization, then my self-esteem plummets. But if I change the dynamic and I say that my self-esteem is not measured by the performance, but measured by how great and productive people do the best work of their lives, then it's a completely different experience. Then my job becomes, again, as I joked this morning in a reference to Game of Thrones, remover of obstacles and breaker of chains, right? My job becomes the person to enable people, not the person to have all the answers and to do it right and to be busier than anybody else and to show them what it means to be productive by doing impossible tasks. So remember, the formula is enhanced leadership and greater resiliency, so you don't die in the process of leading.
Yes, and I'm thinking here in terms of leadership, there's also one of the main struggles is being able to lead ourselves, and that comes first. And that makes me think of the title also of your book. It's Reboot, but it's leadership and the art of growing up. I'm wondering, why is it that we need to grow up to be great leaders? Why can't Peter Pan be a great leader?
Well, it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of referring to people being fully actualized as adults, right? And so part of it is the challenge is Peter Pan, but part of it is that when I define the art of growing up, what I mean is the repeated practice of confronting the parts of ourselves that we don't want to confront, right? In some ways, this is what my next book is really about. It's about the ways in which the ill-formed, uninitiated, non-grown-up person with power leads and creates toxic situations, right? Now, here in the States, we just had a change in presidents, and the good thing about our last president was a perfect example of someone who used their power effectively, ultimately, to make themselves feel better. And that trumped, no pun intended, everything else, right? When a leader, when someone who has power uses the organization to assuage wounds from childhood, no one gets to grow up, right? But when a leader can lean into those moments and say, why am I conflict avoidant? Why must I always have the answer? Why must I always have the last word in the meeting? Where does that stem from? And can I get those feelings that I'm trying to take care of met in a different way? And if I can, then I give the ability for great people to flourish and do the best work of their lives. Do you see the connection?
Yes, absolutely. Because you're no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past, but you're able to let go of them or see it in a different context outside of work, so that you can, for example, go into conflict type situations at work because you're no longer avoiding them because of ghosts of the past. And I have to say that reading your book also made me delve quite deeply into my own introspection and journey to see these patterns, what patterns were coming up. And I hope for all the readers out there that are reading that they have that same experience, because it does invite us to dig and look deeper every time to our own patterns that come up.
Well, nothing can make me happier than to think that people are using the book in that way. They're using my example as a kind of guide, as a leader through the forest of your own experience. And it's like, when I finished the book, I told someone that I felt like I had followed others through the forest of my life so much, and that here I was able to place a pebble in the ground as a continuation of the trail through the dark forest. Here, this is the way. Come this way. And I think that that's a profound honor to be able to place a pebble in that path.
It's a beautiful metaphors. Metaphors is one of your great strengths, with the crow and the asteroids and the lemon drop, but they really help to us to visualize and remember these concepts also. So they're beautiful images, but also extremely useful. I'm thinking of one last topic that we haven't delved into, which is the fact that people generally come to you for guidance, or they're feeling lost and they're looking for that perfect yellow brick road to take them to the land of Oz. And how do you help them to embrace the pathless path, which I've discovered is extremely hard to pronounce? I've practiced a few times. So how do you help them to embrace this? Much better to read it and cope with the uncertainty, because ultimately it's a lot about uncertainty and self-doubt, and not actually having that perfect type A student with all the check boxes.
Yeah, well, I think that the first thing to do is it's the same thing. It's the same first step in every aspect of this process, which is to normalize it. Is to get people to understand that the confusion about the pathless path, about the uncertainty that lies along the way, that confusion doesn't mean that they're broken or less than. It means they're part of a global community in a global experience known as being human, right? Once I say that, once that gets internalized, the internal inner critic, the crow, as we talked about, quiets down. So, okay. So then that opens up the possibility that, well, if that's true, then people in my past may have experienced that as well. And now we get to turn ghosts into ancestors, right? Instead of the ghosts of the past haunting us, they become the ancestors. So your grandfather emigrated from one country to another at 16 years old. Is it possible they felt lost and maybe scared of the confusion and uncertainty? Okay, can you tap into their strength? Can you tap into the strength of others who have come before you? Can you lean into the possibility of you being a future elder to someone else, your child, a friend, and someone else who puts a pebble on the path in the forest and says, come this way. This is the way, right? That connection becomes the ground upon which to understand that being confused in uncertain times is normal. And if it's normal, it's survivable. And if it's survivable, then what are the skills I need to develop to survive? Oh, self-inquiry, pausing, I can do those things. Or as I say in my book, metaphorically, standing still. Just stand still. Stop moving so fast. Let all those scary thoughts catch up to you. Now, how do you feel? Right? We're often so busy running away from the tiger that we don't realize that the minute we stop, the tiger has no intention of eating us. What? That's confusing. And it runs right past us, chasing somebody else.
I think it's also a lot of the time a habit that's developed, this habit of always running and being busy, and people don't often stop to question why they're doing it. Two of the tools of introspection that you mentioned are journaling and meditation. And journaling, you said you started when you were reading Crime and Punishment and you just had the impulse to suddenly start writing. Was that then when you were 13? Because you mentioned earlier that you started. So you're reading Crime and Punishment at 13. That's wonderful. I love Crime and Punishment.
Well, I had a really tough teacher. No, I was in advanced placement class, and I read some amazing books during those years. But yeah, and Crime and Punishment, I don't think I fully understood it until the third time I read it.
Yeah. So those two tools, journaling and meditating, why do you feel they contribute so deeply to this self-inquiry?
Well, I will be clear. I think they contributed deeply to my self-inquiry. And notice that's the stance I like to take, which is not finger wagging. These are the things you should do, but these are the things that I do. And the way they help me is they help me, both stances, both activities help me take what I call the moviegoer stance, where I sit in the theater and I watch the movie of my life with a big bucket of hot buttered popcorn. And I say, look at that crazy guy on the screen. Look at what he's thinking. Right? Because as a moviegoer, we get to see the past. We get to see the future. We get to see, the bad person in the closet who's about to jump out and stab our hero, And by taking that stance, we become less involved with the stories. We become less hooked, as one of my teachers would say, in the storyline, which then activates the parts of our brain neurologically, the prefrontal cortex, that gets to say, what a curious situation this is in. Perhaps it's not as bad as he's feeling. And maybe there's a lesson to be learned in here. So anything that can evoke the moviegoer stance is liberating.
I'm going to think of that next time I meditate. I'll imagine myself eating popcorn and watching a movie. It's a lovely way of looking at it. Jerry, we have a couple of minutes left. What are you not saying that needs to be said for this interview to be complete?
I don't know that I'm aware of anything that's not being said. I would expand and say that I'm really grateful for the way in which you received the book and the work. Sometimes in my heart, I feel like I'm continuing a revolution that my teachers started. And when I have an encounter like this, I feel like I look back over my shoulder and I look at my ancestors and I say, good job, right? See? I'm doing it. And that's a fun feeling. That's a really, really wonderful feeling. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Jerry. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.